A secret is not a shield. It is a debt, and in Seoul, debts are always collected. The Hanol suite existed in a world above the city. 42 floors up, where the air tasted like expensive cologne and older money, where the lighting was deliberately soft. Soft enough to blur the edges of a contract. Soft enough to hide the expression of a man who had already decided someone at his table would not be leaving. The chandeliers above cast everything in amber. The carpet swallowed footsteps whole. And the men seated at the long mahogany table spoke in the careful, measured tones of people who understood that in rooms like this, the most dangerous thing was not a weapon. It was a word. Han Seo-jun had learned that lesson before he ever set foot in this building. He moved through the suite the way he moved through everything, carefully, efficiently, without drawing a single unnecessary breath of attention. His server's vest was pressed to a sharp crease. His tray was level. His face was arranged into the particular blankness that the wealthy found reassuring in the people who served them. Present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. 3 years he had perfected this performance. 3 years of clinical suppressants taken every morning with cold water and no expression. Pharmaceuticals that left a faint metallic taste at the back of his throat and kept the part of him that could destroy everything locked behind chemical walls. In a world where alphas moved like weather systems, loud, inevitable, reshaping everything in their path, an Omega who wanted to survive learned to become invisible. Seo-jun had become very, very good at disappearing. He reached for the bottle. A 2009 Pomerol, dark as a bruise, chosen for men whose tastes ran as expensive as their enemies. He moved to the far end of the table first, as he always did. Poured without spilling. Smiled without meaning it. Kept his eyes low and his breathing even and told himself what he told himself every night he worked this floor. Just another dinner. Just another deal. Just another room full of men with too much power and not enough conscience. Pour the wine. Collect the tip. Go home. Then the door opened. And Han Seo-jun felt it before he heard it, before he saw anything at all. A shift in the room's atmosphere so sudden and complete it was almost physical, like the air itself had snapped to attention. The quiet conversations at the table faltered. The 2 bodyguards already positioned by the window straightened almost imperceptibly. Even the candlelight seemed to pull itself upright. Lee Min-jae did not walk into rooms. He arrived in them. Seo-jun did not look up. He had learned very early that looking at certain alphas directly was an invitation to be seen. And being seen was the one thing he could not afford. But he felt the man cross the room the way you feel a change in weather. A pressure behind the sternum, slow and undeniable. Biology waking up beneath all those careful chemical walls like something that had been sleeping and had just remembered it was alive. No. Seo-jun breathed through it. Absolutely not. He set the bottle down. Kept his eyes on the table. Watched, in his peripheral vision, as Lee Min-jae settled into the chair at the head of the table. White shirt open at the collar, ink curling past the fabric like words written in a language made of consequences, pen already in hand as though he had decided the evening's outcome before he ever sat down. Beside him, Park Hyun-woo arranged documents with the careful efficiency of a man who had been planning this night for a very long time. Seo-jun moved to the next place setting. Poured. Breathed. Did not look. The negotiations began, low, formal, the clipped cadence of men building something large and discussing it in deliberately small terms. Japanese across the table, Korean on Min-jae's side, a polished back and forth that Seo-jun filtered into background noise the way he filtered out everything in this room that was not his immediate task. And then he heard it. A phrase. Embedded in a contract clause. Spoken in archaic Korean. The kind that had not been used in formal business in 30 years. The kind that a foreign delegation would never catch. The kind that Seo-jun recognized only because his father had been a fixer for men exactly like the ones seated at this table, and had made Seo-jun memorize the old language like a survival manual before he was old enough to understand why. Seo-jun's hand went still on the wine bottle. His blood went colder than the glass. Because what Park Hyun-woo had just said, folded neatly inside a discussion about projected revenue figures, spoken with the casual smoothness of a man reciting something he had rehearsed 100 times, was not a contract term at all. It was a signal. And the thing it was signaling, the thing it had just set into quiet, irreversible motion, was the death of the man sitting 3 feet away from Han Seo-jun, still writing his name in the margin of a document, still breathing, still completely unaware that the person he trusted most in this world had just given the order to end him. Seo-jun set the bottle down very carefully. The room glittered around him, amber light, expensive silence, the soft scratch of a pen. And he understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives at the edge of something irreversible, that there was no version of tonight in which he simply poured the wine and went home. He had spent 3 years learning to be invisible. Tonight, invisibility was going to cost a man his life. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. Han Seo-jun woke at 5:47 every morning. Not because an alarm told him to, but because his body had learned that discipline was the only thing standing between the life he had built and the life that would swallow him whole if he gave it a single opening. The suppressants came first. Always first. 2 small white tablets from the unmarked bottle he kept behind the loose tile beneath his bathroom sink, chased with exactly half a glass of cold water. Not warm. Cold. Warmth opened the blood vessels, and open blood vessels meant the scent moved faster. And a moving scent was a story he could not afford to tell. He had read that in the 3rd chapter of a black market biology manual he had memorized and then burned in his kitchen sink 2 years ago, standing over the flames in a towel, watching the pages curl like confessions. He checked his reflection the way a soldier checks equipment before deployment. Methodical. Impersonal. Looking not at himself but at the surface of himself, for anything that might give him away. He had a face that people found easy to overlook, which had once been the thing he hated most about it, and was now the thing he valued above almost everything else. Sharp jaw, careful eyes, the kind of stillness in his expression that read as professionalism to strangers and cost him something he no longer had a name for to maintain. By 6:15 he was dressed. By 6:30 he was on the subway, standing because sitting meant proximity, and proximity this early, before the 2nd tablet had fully settled into his bloodstream, was a variable he preferred to eliminate. He held the overhead bar and watched his own reflection in the dark window across the carriage and thought about nothing. He had become exceptionally good at thinking about nothing. He had started at the Hanol Suite 3 years ago with a forged secondary gender classification card that had cost him 4 months of savings and a conversation he never wanted to repeat, in a parking garage in Mapo-gu, with a man who smelled like cigarettes and asked too many questions before finally sliding the laminated card across the hood of a car like he was doing Seo-jun a favor. In a way, he was. The card said beta. The card was the most important document Seo-jun owned. More important than his ID. More important than his lease. Because without it, he would never have been hired, and without the job, he would have had nothing. No income, no structure, no reason to keep taking the tablets every morning with mechanical precision. The Hanol Suite did not hire Omegas. No establishment like it did. The logic was never spoken aloud because it didn't need to be. Alpha clientele paid for environments where the variables were controlled, where nothing biological might complicate the atmosphere of a dinner that was worth more than most people earned in a decade. An omega on the floor was a disruption waiting to happen. A liability. A distraction. Seo-jun had decided 3 years ago that he would simply decline to be any of those things. "You're 4 minutes early," said Chaiwon, without looking up from the reservation book when he pushed through the staff entrance at 3:56. She was the floor supervisor, small, precise, with the energy of someone who had been disappointed by people so many times that she had simply stopped expecting anything and found it very freeing. "I'm always 4 minutes early," Seo-jun said, pulling his vest from his locker. "I know. It unsettles me. Would you prefer I was late?" She looked up at that, studied him for a moment with eyes that missed very little, then returned to her book. "I'd prefer you were normal. You're not, but the guests don't notice, so." She turned a page. "Private booking tonight. 42nd floor. Full suite. You're on wine service." He nodded and said nothing. "Min Jae." She said the name the way people said the names of weather events. Not with fear exactly, but with the careful respect one extended to forces that operated outside the ordinary rules of consequence. "Lee Min Jae. And Associates." Seo-jun fastened the last button on his vest. "I know who he is. Everyone knows who he is. That's rather the point." She closed the book. "No mistakes tonight, Seo-jun. Not a dropped fork. Not a slow pour. Not a single moment where anyone at that table has cause to look at you for longer than it takes to accept a glass of wine." "They never do," he said. And that was true. In 3 years of working the most exclusive private floor in Seoul, 3 years of serving men whose names appeared in newspapers always in connection with things that were never quite proven, not a single guest had looked at Han Seo-jun and seen anything worth remembering. He was the vest. He was the tray. He was the hand that poured and then withdrew. He had refined himself down to a function, and functions, he had learned, were blessedly invisible. He spent the hours before service doing what he always did. checking the glassware for watermarks, confirming the wine list against the booking specifications, moving through the suite in the particular silence of a person who had made peace with taking up no space. The amber lighting came on at 6. The table was set by 6:30. The room smelled of fresh flowers and old wood, and the particular expectant stillness of a stage before the curtain rises. Seo-jun stood at his station, tray at his side, and breathed slowly, and told himself what he always told himself. Invisible. Efficient. Forgettable. Just another night. He believed it completely and without reservation, right up until the door opened. And everything he had spent 3 years building held its breath. The door opened at 8:03 p.m. Seo-jun knew this because he had been watching the clock above the service entrance with the focused attention of someone who used time the way other people used prayer, as something to hold on to when the ground felt uncertain. 2 minutes behind schedule. In a room like this, 2 minutes meant nothing. In a man like Lee Min-jae's world, Seo-jun suspected, 2 minutes meant exactly as much as Lee Min-jae decided it meant, and not a second more. He felt it before he heard the door. Before the bodyguard's footsteps crossed the threshold or Park Hyun-woo's voice carried through in low, preparatory tones. It started somewhere behind his sternum, a pressure, almost structural, like a beam shifting inside a building that had been holding very still for a very long time. His biology, despite everything he had fed it this morning, despite the 2 tablets and the cold water and the years of practiced suppression, lifted its head like an animal that had caught a scent on the wind and remembered, suddenly and inconveniently, what it was made for. Seo-jun set his jaw and looked at the wine bottle in his hand. No, he told himself, the word flat and internal and final. Not tonight. Not ever. He heard Hyun-woo first, smooth, accommodating, the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that charm was a more efficient weapon than force. The suite is exactly as requested. Mr. Tanaka's delegation will arrive within the hour. Plenty of time to review the final terms. A pause. Then a voice that was none of those things. Not smooth, not accommodating, not warm in any way that invited comfort. Low. Certain. The kind of voice that did not perform authority because it had never needed to. I've read the terms. Lee Min-jae walked into the Hanul suite, and the room did what rooms did when he entered them. It reorganized itself around him. Not visibly. The furniture did not move, the lighting did not shift. But something atmospheric recalibrated, the way a compass needle swings when a magnet comes close. The 2 bodyguards took positions at the room's perimeter with the silent efficiency of men who had done this so many times it had become biological. Hyun-woo moved to the table, setting down a leather document case with careful hands. Seo-jun did not turn around. He focused on the bottle, on the angle of the pour he would use for the first glass, on the grain of the wood in the serving cart beside him. He counted his own heartbeats with the detached precision of a man diffusing something, which was, in a very real sense, exactly what he was doing. The pressure in his chest intensified. Spread. He had read, in the manual he had burned, in the dog-eared secondary texts he had studied before those 2 became dangerous to keep, that suppressants did not eliminate biological recognition. They muted it. They turned a shout into a whisper. But a whisper in a quiet enough room was still perfectly audible. For more hours, he told himself. Pour the wine. Answer when spoken to. Disappear. Is the 2009 Pomerol on the list tonight? The question was not directed at anyone in particular. It landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Without urgency, but with the expectation that someone would respond to the ripples. Seo-jun turned. He kept his expression arranged into its professional blankness as he faced the room, tray settling against his forearm with practiced steadiness. Yes, he said, and held up the bottle at a slight angle so the label caught the light. Decanted 30 minutes ago, sir. It should be at optimal temperature. Lee Min-jae was looking at the document Hyun-woo had placed on the table. He did not look up immediately. He finished reading whatever line had held his attention, turned the page with one hand, and then, only then, raised his eyes. They found Seo-jun across the room with an accuracy that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. For a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, Lee Min-jae simply looked at him. Not the way the suite's other guests looked at the serving staff, which was to say not really looked at all, the gaze sliding past without landing, processing the white vest and the tray and concluding function, not person. Min-jae looked the way a man looks when something has snagged his attention and he has not yet decided what to do with that information. Unhurried. Direct. His expression gave away nothing, but his eyes, dark, still, carrying the particular quality of someone who had spent years reading rooms for variables that could kill him, did not move from Seo Jun's face. Seo Jun did not look away. Looking away too quickly was its own kind of signal. He met the gaze for exactly as long as was professionally appropriate, inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, and shifted his attention to the table. "Shall I pour now, or would you prefer to wait for your guests?" Another beat. Then Min Jae returned his attention to the document. "Now, of course." Seo Jun crossed to the table, aware, with every nerve he had spent 3 years trying to silence, of the exact distance between himself and the man seated at its head. He stopped at the appropriate position, tilted the bottle, watched the wine breathe into the glass in a slow, dark ribbon, and kept his eyes on the pour. Steady. Level. The performance of someone who is simply doing his job and nothing else. "You've worked this floor long?" The question came from Hyun-woo, not from Min Jae, delivered with the conversational pleasantness of a man who asked questions as a reflex. 3 years, Seo Jun said. "You enjoy it?" He glanced up briefly, offered the faint, professional smile he kept in reserve for exactly this kind of exchange. The kind that said I am pleased to be of service without saying anything at all about what was actually true. "I find it suits me." Hyun-woo smiled back, easy and immediate, and returned to his documents. Seo Jun straightened, stepped back, and returned to his station. He set the bottle down. He breathed. He stared at the middle distance and performed, for the approximately 1,000th time in his professional life, the internal act of dismantling a feeling before it could become a liability. He was almost finished when he became aware, without looking, of the precise and quiet weight of being watched. He did not turn. He knew if he turned he would find Lee Min-jae's eyes still on him. Not predatory, not aggressive, but with that same unnerving quality of attention that seemed to operate outside the ordinary social contract, that said I notice things that other people decide not to notice. And he could not afford the particular chain reaction that looking back would set off inside him. So he straightened his tray. He checked the second bottle. He reminded himself, firmly and without sentiment, of everything he stood to lose. Across the room, he heard the soft scratch of a pen moving across paper. And underneath it, barely at the very edge of his suppressed and battered senses, he felt the exact moment Lee Min-jae finally looked away. It felt, absurdly and against every rational argument he had available to him, like losing something he had never been permitted to have. The Japanese delegation arrived at 8:47 p.m. There were 4 of them, Mr. Tanaka at the front, silver-haired and unhurried, with the particular stillness of a man who had conducted enough negotiations to understand that the first person to show urgency had already lost. Behind him, 2 associates carried matching document cases, and a younger man with wire-framed glasses positioned himself slightly apart from the group in the way that interpreters always did, claiming a neutral geography that belonged to neither side. Seo Jun watched them enter from his station and noted, with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 3 years reading rooms, the precise choreography of the greeting. Min Jae rose. Not eagerly. Nothing about Lee Min Jae suggested eagerness, but with a measured respect that acknowledged Tanaka as an equal without conceding anything. They exchanged cards with both hands, the small formal ritual performed with the seriousness it deserved. Hyun-woo translated the opening pleasantries in smooth, contemporary Korean, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man entirely comfortable moving between languages. Seo Jun began his circuit of the table. This was the part of the evening he had always found easiest, the moving. When he was stationary, he was aware of himself in space, aware of the distance between his body and the alphas in the room, aware of his own breathing in a way that required active management. But moving gave him purpose, and purpose gave him cover. And cover was the closest thing to peace that Han Seo Jun had found in 3 years of living this way. He refreshed glasses. He cleared a small appetizer plate. He repositioned a water pitcher 2 inches to the left, and then 2 inches back, because it had not needed repositioning, and the movement had simply been something to do with his hands. The negotiation settled into its rhythm around him. Numbers. Percentages. Projected timelines delivered in the measured back and forth of men who were building something large and discussing it in deliberately small increments. Seo Jun filtered it the way he filtered everything in this room. Into background, into texture, into noise that was not his business and not his concern. And then something snagged. It was subtle enough that he almost missed it. A single phrase from Hyun-woo, delivered in the same smooth cadence as everything before it, sliding into the translation of a clause about exclusivity rights. Seo Jun was reaching for an empty glass at the corner of the table when the words registered. Not immediately, not all at once, but the way a wrong note registers in a familiar song. A half-second delay between hearing and understanding, and then the understanding arrived with the cold, clarifying force of water through a cracked wall. The phrasing was archaic. Not stylistically, not the way older speakers sometimes defaulted to classical forms out of habit, but deliberately, surgically archaic. A construction that had not appeared in standard Korean business dialect for 30 years, that existed now only in certain legal texts and, more relevantly, in the operational language of organizations that had reason to communicate things in plain sight without being understood. His father had called it the language of knives. You use it when you need someone in the room to hear something, his father had told him once, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of tea and the patient gravity of a man passing down knowledge he hoped his son would never need. And you need everyone else in the room to hear nothing at all. Seo-jun set the glass down. He did not move to the next position immediately. He adjusted the placement of a fork that did not need adjusting, and he listened. Hyun-woo was speaking again, still smooth, still translating the clause about territorial distribution, his voice carrying no inflection that would alert anyone watching his face. But underneath the contemporary phrasing, threaded through it like wire through silk, the archaic construction continued. A word here, a suffix there. Structural choices that meant nothing individually and, assembled in sequence, meant something that made the temperature in Seo-jun's chest drop several degrees. He needed to hear it again. He needed to be certain. He moved to the serving cart position 3 feet from Hyun-woo's left shoulder, and he made himself slow. He examined the label of a bottle that required no examination. He counted Hyun-woo's words with the part of his mind that his father had trained like a muscle. The part that could hold 2 conversations simultaneously, that could parse meaning from syntax while his face remained professionally empty. The third clause covers response windows, Hyun-woo was saying to the room, in clean and current Korean. 48 hours for formal acknowledgement, 72 for executed documentation. What the archaic thread underneath it said was different. Confirmation received. Execute on signature. Seo-jun's hand stilled on the bottle. Execute on signature. Not a metaphor. Not a business term co-opted for dramatic emphasis. The way people sometimes used words like kill and destroy in boardrooms without meaning either. This was operational language, spoken by a man who understood its original context perfectly, directed at someone in this room who understood it equally well. An instruction. A timeline. A green light given in a language that the man it was designed to end could not speak, wrapped inside a negotiation he had no reason to distrust, delivered by the person sitting closest to his right hand. The moment the pen left the paper, Lee Min-jae would be dead. Seo-jun set the bottle down on the cart with a care that he felt distantly grateful for, because the alternative was that his hands would shake, and his hands could not shake, not here, not now. He breathed through his nose, slowly, evenly, and looked at the middle distance and performed the internal act that 3 years had made automatic. The systematic dismantling of a feeling before it could reach his face. This one was harder than most. More water? He said, and his voice came out at precisely the correct professional register, directed at the associate nearest him. The man glanced up, nodded briefly, and returned to his documents. Seo-jun poured. His hand did not shake. He moved to the next position. And the next. And with every step he turned the phrase over in his mind, testing it from every angle the way his father had taught him, looking for the charitable interpretation, the innocent reading, the possibility that he was wrong. That 3 years of isolation had made him paranoid. That the archaic construction was a stylistic tic, a regional habit, a coincidence of phrasing that his overprimed mind had assembled into a pattern that did not exist. Execute on signature. There was no charitable interpretation. He came to rest at his station and stood with his tray and looked at the table. At Tanaka reviewing a document, at Min-jae listening with the closed, unreadable attention he brought to everything, at Hyun-woo turning a page with his careful hands, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its totality, that he was the only person in this room who knew what was about to happen, and that he had, at most, until the end of the negotiation to decide what to do about it. Across the table, Min-jae reached for his pen. Seo-jun watched the movement and felt something shift in him. Not the biological pull from before, not the suppressed instinct that the tablets kept behind glass. Something older than that. Something his father had put there long before Seo-jun understood what it would cost him. The only thing more dangerous than knowing, his father had said, is knowing and doing nothing. He picked up the wine bottle. He began to cross the room. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. He had taken 11 steps toward the table when his body staged its first argument. It arrived not as thought but as sensation, a cold, systemic contraction that started somewhere beneath his ribs and moved outward, the way ice moves across still water, until it had reached every extremity and delivered its message with clinical efficiency. Stop. Turn around. Set the bottle down and walk to the service entrance, and do not look back. His suppressants, for all their limitations, had never failed to reinforce this instinct. They were designed for exactly this, not just to mask his scent, but to keep the parts of him that were ungovernable pressed beneath the surface, where they could not make decisions that his rational mind would have to survive. He took his 12th step. And his 13th. Think, he told himself. Think before you do something that cannot be undone. He slowed his approach, redirected toward the service cart on the eastern wall, buying himself time inside the movement. His father had taught him that too. Never stop walking in a room full of people who are paid to notice when something changes. Keep your body performing one thing while your mind performs another. A useful skill for a fixer's son. A necessary one for whatever Seo Jun had become in the years since. He set the bottle on the cart and made a small, unnecessary adjustment to the linen beside it and let his mind run the argument properly, the way it deserved to be run. The first position was the one his body had already voted for, emphatically and without abstention. He did not know these men. Lee Min-jae was not a good man. No one who operated at the level Min-jae operated at arrived there through virtue. Whatever was about to happen to him was the product of a world he had built and choices he had made. And those choices existed at an altitude so far above Han Seo-jun's life that involving himself was not bravery, it was catastrophic miscalculation. He had a lease. He had a job. He had an unmarked bottle behind a loose bathroom tile and a forged card in his wallet and a life assembled from the wreckage of a previous one. And every single piece of it depended on his continued invisibility. One word, one moment of being truly seen in this room, and all of it came apart. The second position was the one he could not look at directly, and so looked at sideways, the way you look at something very bright. He had heard the phrase. He had understood it. And understanding it made him the only thing standing between a man's life and the last half-inch of a pen stroke. He had been that distance away from saving someone once before. He had not moved. And he had spent every morning since then taking his suppressants with cold water and thinking about it for exactly as long as it took to swallow. His father's name was Han Jae-won. He had been, for 17 years, one of the most trusted fixers in Seoul's criminal infrastructure. Not a violent man, not a man who ordered the things that required fixing, but the man who arrived afterward with quiet competence and made the evidence of them disappear. He had been good at it. He had been respected in the way that people who are useful to dangerous men are respected, which is to say, completely, until they are not. The organization that employed him had decided, in the winter of Seo Jun's 19th year, that Jae-won had become a liability. Not because he had stolen from them or betrayed them or made an error significant enough to justify what followed, but because he had learned something he was not supposed to know, and learning it meant he could not be trusted to keep it forever, and in the world his father had chosen to inhabit, indefinite trust was the only acceptable kind. Someone had known what was coming. Seo Jun had pieced that together later, slowly, from fragments. A conversation overheard, a visit that ended too quickly, a phone call his father had received 3 days before the end that left him sitting at the kitchen table with his tea going cold, and an expression Seo Jun had not known how to read at 19 and could read perfectly now. Someone had known and said nothing, and his father had walked into a room he did not walk out of. Seo Jun had not known. He had been the one person in his father's life with no knowledge of what was coming and therefore no choice to make. And he had told himself that consistently and with considerable effort for years. He had made it almost true. But he knew now. He was standing in it now. And the difference between I didn't know and I knew and I chose myself was a distance he could measure precisely, because he had been living in it for 3 years. And it was exactly the size of the hollow thing behind his sternum that no suppressant had ever touched. You cannot fix the past by destroying your future, said the rational part of his mind, in the reasonable tone it adopted when it was fighting hard for something. He picked up the bottle. This is not your world, it continued. These are not your people. You are a man with a forged card in his pocket standing in a room that will close around you like a fist the moment you make yourself visible. He turned from the cart. Think about the lease. Think about the tablet behind the tile. Think about everything you have spent 3 years building. He thought about his father's kitchen table. The cold cup of tea. The expression he had not known how to read. Walk away. Excuse me. He stopped. The voice belonged to one of Tanaka's associates, the younger one, wire-framed glasses slightly crooked, who had apparently decided that the server standing motionless beside the cart was an invitation for conversation. He was holding an empty glass with the vaguely apologetic expression of someone who wanted something and felt mildly guilty about the wanting. "Could I trouble you for the still water? I find sparkling sits poorly during long evenings." Seo-jun looked at him, at the empty glass, at the perfect, ordinary smallness of the request. The kind of request that belonged to a world where the worst thing that could happen at dinner was carbonation. He felt something settle in him then, not warmly, not with any comfort, but with the flat and irrevocable weight of a decision that had already been made before he had finished arguing against it. It had been made, he understood, the moment he heard the phrase. Perhaps before that. Perhaps it had been waiting for him since a winter evening 6 years ago when he had been 19 and ignorant and had not had a choice. He had a choice now. "Of course," he said to the associate, and poured the water, and set the glass down with a steady hand, and turned toward the head of the table, where Lee Min-jae sat with his pen in his hand, and the last uncrossed distance of his life stretching out ahead of him like a bridge that was already burning from the other side. Seo-jun crossed the room. He did not let himself think any further than the next step, and then the next, because thinking was finished, and what came after thinking was simply the thing itself. The moment where everything you had built either proved it was worth keeping or proved it had only ever been a very elaborate way of hiding. He reached the table. He raised the bottle. And he leaned down to pour. The wine poured in a slow, dark ribbon. Seo-jun watched it fall and thought about nothing except the angle of the bottle and the level of the glass and the distance between the rim and the surface of the liquid, which required exactly the kind of focused, physical attention that kept his hands from communicating what his mind was doing. The pomerol caught the amber light as it moved, deep red at the center, bruised purple at the edges. And it was beautiful in the remote, unattached way that things sometimes became beautiful when you were looking at them from the far side of a decision you could not take back. Min-jae did not look up. He was reviewing the final page of the document. Seo-jun could see it in his peripheral vision without turning his head, the dense columns of figures and clauses that represented, to everyone else in this room, the conclusion of a legitimate negotiation. His pen rested between two fingers with the casual authority of a man who had signed things of consequence before and expected to do so again. Across the table, Tanaka was exchanging a quiet word with his senior associate. Hyun-woo was turned slightly toward the interpreter, one hand on the document case, his posture the perfect architecture of a man with nothing to hide. Seo-jun straightened a fraction, not fully, not enough to signal completion, and let the silence of the pour do what it had always done. Render him furniture. A function. The hand attached to the bottle that everyone's gaze moved past on its way to something more important. He had perhaps 4 seconds before straightening completely, and stepping back became the only professionally acceptable movement available to him. He used the first second to confirm what he already knew. That Hyun-woo was watching the interpreter and not the server, that the bodyguards were oriented toward the room's entrance, that Min-jae's attention was on the page, and that no one in the Hanul suite was looking at Han Seo-jun. He used the second to close the remaining distance. A fractional shift of his weight, a slight drop of his shoulder that brought his mouth to within inches of Min-jae's ear, disguised inside the natural lean of a careful pour. He used the third second to speak. "He wants you dead." The words left him in Korean, barely voiced, less than a whisper. The kind of sound that existed at the precise threshold where breath became language, audible to the person it was aimed at and to no one else. "Your advisor." The phrase in the third clause. "Execute on signature. Don't sign." He used the 4th second to straighten. Then he stepped back, repositioned the bottle against his forearm, and walked away from the table without looking back. His footsteps were even. His tray was level. His face, when he passed one of the bodyguards near the service wall, held the same professional blankness it always held, the expression of a man performing a function and nothing more. He reached his station. He set the bottle down, and the table went utterly still. Not loudly. There was no gasp, no sudden movement, no visible disruption of the kind that would have told the room something had shifted. It was the silence underneath the existing silence, a cessation of the small ambient movements that people made without knowing they made them. The rustle of a page, the quiet repositioning of a glass, the barely audible rhythm of a room in normal function. All of it stopped for 2 heartbeats, 3, and in that stoppage was the specific quality of held breath. Seo-jun did not turn around. He looked at the serving cart and counted his own pulse. 1, 2, 3, and waited for the sound of a chair being pushed back, for a word spoken in a raised voice, for the particular shift in room acoustics that would tell him someone was moving toward him. He had run this calculation in the 4 steps between the table and his station. The moment Min-jae reacted, Hyunwoo would know something had gone wrong. The moment Hyunwoo knew, Seo-jun became the only variable that needed immediate management. The bodyguards were on salary for precisely this kind of management. He had, at best, the length of Min-jae's reaction time between what he had just done and what it would cost him. This clause. Min-jae's voice came from the head of the table, unhurried, almost conversational, landing in the resumed stillness of the room with the weight of something that had been placed there with full deliberation. Walk me through it again. Seo-jun exhaled. Of course. Hyunwoo's voice carried a smoothness that was 1 layer thinner than it had been before. Not enough that anyone untrained would notice, but enough. The exclusivity provision stipulates that. Not you. A beat. Him. Min-jae's meaning clarified itself in the silence that followed, and Seo-jun understood from the subtle shift in the room's acoustics that Min-jae was looking at the interpreter. From the original Japanese. Directly. A pause in which something unspoken moved through the room like a current. Certainly, the interpreter said, in the careful tone of a man who had just understood that the architecture of the evening had changed and was adjusting his position accordingly. He leaned forward, found the clause, and began to read. What he read did not match what Hyunwoo had translated. The difference was not large. In a standard negotiation between men who trusted their advisors, it would never have been caught. But it was there, a directional reversal in the exclusivity terms, a timeline altered by 18 months. A liability clause shifted from one party to the other with the surgical precision of someone who had been planning this particular misdirection long enough to make it look native to the document. The interpreter finished. The room held itself. I see, said Min-jae. 2 words. No inflection. The most dangerous kind of calm. Seo-jun was looking at the serving cart and seeing none of it. His whole body had oriented itself toward the sound of that voice with an involuntary precision that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the biology he had spent 3 years suppressing, which had chosen this particular moment, adrenaline spiking, chemical walls shaking at their foundations, to remind him that it had never actually agreed to the terms of their arrangement. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the cart. The pressure helped. Mr. Tanaka. Min-jae again, unhurried. I wonder if you'd be willing to extend the evening. I believe we have more to discuss than the current draft reflects. Tanaka's response was brief and immediate. I believe you are right. The sound that followed was the document case being moved. Not violently, not with any drama, just repositioned to a different part of the table, which in this context was its own complete sentence. Then the sound of a chair, Hyunwoo's, going very still, in the way chairs went still when the people in them had just finished a calculation and did not like the answer. Hyunwoo. Min-jae's voice had not changed. That was the most frightening thing about it. Step outside. A silence that lasted approximately 1 lifetime. Of course, Hyunwoo said. And in the careful, even sound of his footsteps crossing to the door, Seo-jun heard the precise acoustic signature of a man who knew he was already finished and had decided that performing composure was the only dignity remaining to him. The door opened. The door closed. Seo-jun stood at his station and looked at his own hands on the edge of the cart, and they were steady, and he was grateful for that, because everything else inside him was shaking like a building in a storm. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular aftermath of a moment where you discover that the thing you spent 3 years believing you no longer were, the person who moved toward the fire instead of away from it, was, in fact, exactly what you still were. Behind him, he heard Lee Min-jae set his pen down on the table. Not a signature. Just a sound, but it landed in Seo-jun's chest like something restored. The door had been closed for 11 seconds when Lee Min-jae spoke again. Gentlemen. He addressed the Japanese delegation with the same measured ease he might have used to redirect a conversation about the weather. Nothing in his voice to suggest that his most trusted advisor had just been removed from the room. Nothing to suggest that the evening had become something other than what it had been announced as. I apologize for the interruption. These things occasionally require management. Tanaka inclined his head with the equanimity of a man who had conducted enough negotiations in enough rooms to understand that interruptions were sometimes the most informative part. Not at all. Min-jae reached for his wine glass. He did not reach for his pen. Seo-jun watched from his station with the focused peripheral attention he had developed over 3 years of being invisible in rooms where everything mattered. He had expected, had braced for, something visible. A confrontation. The particular sharp-edged energy of a man who had just learned he was marked for death processing that information in real time. But what Lee Min-jae was doing instead was so controlled, so entirely without the texture of reaction, that it took Seo-jun several seconds to understand he was watching something deliberate. This was not a man absorbing a shock. This was a man who had already moved 3 steps past the shock and was now arranging the board. The exclusivity clause, Min-jae said, setting his glass down. Before we proceed, I'd like to revisit the territorial boundaries, specifically the Busan Corridor provisions. He turned to his remaining associate, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Director Shin, who had said very little all evening and, Seo-jun now understood, had been listening to everything. Pull the annex. Sir. Shin opened a secondary document case that had sat untouched beneath the table for the duration of the evening. A case that Hyun-woo had not known existed, which became apparent in the way the interpreter's eyes moved to it with a recognition that was not professional familiarity, but its opposite. The annex contained, Seo-jun gathered from the fragments that reached him, a parallel version of the contract. Identical in most respects. Different in the ways that mattered. I had this prepared as a secondary framework, Min-jae said to Tanaka, in the tone of a man making a reasonable disclosure. Given that negotiations of this complexity occasionally benefit from comparative review. He slid it across the table. You'll find the 3rd clause reflects somewhat different terms than the version your team was working from this evening. Tanaka received the document. He read. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A very slight recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has just understood that the person across the table had known considerably more than he had shown. I see several discrepancies, Tanaka said. Yes, said Min-jae. So do I. The weight of that landed cleanly and was not elaborated upon. It did not need to be. What followed was not an argument or a confrontation or anything that would have been recognizable as a crisis to someone observing from a distance. It looked from the outside like a negotiation resuming. Documents compared, clauses discussed, the interpreter now working from the annex rather than the corrupted original. But underneath the procedural surface, Min-jae was doing something that Seo-jun found himself watching with an attention that had moved beyond professional and into something closer to unwilling admiration. He was dismantling everything Hyun-woo had built, piece by piece, in real time, without ever once naming what he was dismantling or why. Every falsified term in the original document was addressed through the comparative framework of the annex, corrected, replaced, neutralized, without the word betrayal entering the room. Without accusation. Without any language that might destabilize the negotiation or give Tanaka's delegation cause for concern. He was performing the function of a man conducting straightforward business, while simultaneously performing the function of a man quietly pulling a knife from his own back and placing it on the table, where everyone could see it, but no one was required to acknowledge it directly. It was, Seo-jun thought, one of the most controlled things he had ever witnessed. The response timeline, Min-jae said, turning another page. 48 hours is insufficient for proper legal review on our side. I'd propose 96. Agreed, said Tanaka, immediately and without consulting his associates, which was its own kind of answer about how much Tanaka had understood from the moment the annex appeared on the table. Seo-jun poured water for an associate who hadn't asked for it and used the movement to bring himself 2 feet closer to the proceedings than his station strictly warranted. He was aware that this was not sensible. He was aware that every additional minute he spent in this room, after what he had done, was a minute in which the calculation of his continued presence could shift in ways he could not predict. But something had happened to his capacity for sensible self-preservation in the last 20 minutes, and it was standing very close to the thing that happened to him whenever Lee Min-jae's voice entered a silence and rearranged it. Min-jae signed the annex at 10:14 p.m. A single, unhurried stroke. He did not look at Seo-jun when he did it. Tanaka signed beneath him. The interpreter witnessed. Director Shin collected both copies with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. A productive evening, Tanaka said, rising. More productive than anticipated, Min-jae agreed. The pleasantries of departure moved through the room. Bows exchanged, cards confirmed, the careful social architecture of men concluding business. And then the Japanese delegation was gone, and the Hanul suite held only Min-jae, Director Shin, the single remaining bodyguard, and the server who had no reason left to still be standing here. Min-jae had not looked at him once since the delegation departed. Then he did. Close the door, he said. Not to Shin. Not to the bodyguard. To Seo-jun. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from." Seo Jun closed the door. The sound it made, a soft, pressurized click, the kind that belonged to rooms built for privacy, seemed to rearrange the suite's atmosphere in the same way that Min Jae's arrival had rearranged it 2 hours ago. Everything that had been performance and procedure and the careful maintenance of professional distance collapsed into something smaller and more airless. Just the four of them now. The amber lighting, the signed documents on the table, and the particular quality of attention that Lee Min-jae directed at Han Seo-jun when Han Seo-jun turned around. He had taken 2 steps back toward his station. Some residual instinct toward the position, toward the function, toward the last available architecture of invisibility, when the window behind Director Shin exploded inward. Not glass. The frame. A tactical breach, fast and coordinated, the kind that required planning and equipment and the specific knowledge of which floor, which suite, which moment in the evening would find the room at its most contained. 2 men through the window before the sound had finished registering, a third through the service entrance that Seo-jun had used every day for 3 years, and in the half-second between comprehension and response the suite became a different kind of room entirely. Not a dining room, not a negotiation space, but the thing it had apparently always been underneath, a location. Hyunwoo's men. It did not require analysis. The coordination was too precise, the timing too calibrated to the conclusion of the signing, and the instruction they were operating under had been given in archaic Korean 45 minutes ago in this same room. Execute on signature. The signature had happened. The execution was now in progress, adapted for the fact that it had not gone as planned. Director Shin moved first, away from the window, toward Min-jae, body positioning itself between the breach and the principal with the automatic geometry of a man whose entire professional purpose was this exact reconfiguration of space. The bodyguard near the wall was already in motion, and the suite filled with the sounds of furniture and bodies, and the particular sharp efficiency of people who had trained for this, while the people around them had been living ordinary lives. Seo-jun pressed back against the closed door. His training was in nutrition and service and the chemical management of his own biology. He had no geometry for this room. He had no protocol. What he had was the door handle against his palm and the instruction his body was delivering with considerably more force than it had delivered anything else this evening. An instruction that was not rational and was not suppressant compatible and was, at its absolute core, the most purely biological thing he had felt since the moment Lee Min-jae had walked through the entrance and the room had reorganized itself accordingly. Run, it said. Or don't run. But breathe. He was breathing. He was aware that he was breathing. He was aware, in the same moment, that his breathing had changed, had shifted from the slow, controlled rhythm he had maintained for 3 years into something faster and shallower, and laced with the adrenaline that was now moving through his bloodstream with the unstoppable momentum of something that had been waiting behind a door for a very long time. The suppressants registered the adrenaline. The adrenaline won. He felt it happen before he could stop it. The chemical mass cracking along its load-bearing lines, not all at once, but in the way that structures failed under sudden force. First a fracture, then a cascade, then the thing underneath pouring through every opening at once. His scent hit the air like a frequency, present, unmistakable, the specific biological signature of an omega under acute distress, which was one of the most potent and least ignorable things that could enter a room containing multiple alphas. The effect was immediate and involuntary. Both of Hyunwoo's men faltered, a half-second disruption, instinct overriding training, their bodies responding to the olfactory information before their minds could override it. Director Shin turned, not toward the threat, but toward Seo-jun, with an expression that moved through surprise and into something more complicated in the space of a single breath. The bodyguard turned. Min-jae turned. And then Min-jae was crossing the room. He moved without urgency and without hesitation, which was somehow more alarming than either would have been alone. The specific quality of motion that belonged to someone who had already decided, and was simply now completing the decision. He reached Seo-jun in 4 strides and placed himself between Seo-jun and the room with the same natural authority with which he did everything, as though this too was simply a clause in a document he had already reviewed. His back was to Seo-jun. He was facing the room. "Finish it," he said to Shin. 2 words, quiet as everything else he said, and Shin turned back to the business of the room's management with the focused efficiency of a man who had been given clear instruction. Seo-jun stood behind Lee Min-jae and tried to remember how to regulate his own breathing and found, for the first time in 3 years, that the effort was entirely beyond him. His scent was still moving. He could feel it, the way you felt a wound you couldn't see, and there was nothing left in his depleted chemical arsenal to recall it. I know what you are, Min-jae said. He had not turned around. His voice was low, directed at the middle distance in front of him, clearly intended for the person behind him. I've known since the second pour. Seo-jun's back met the door. Then you know my employment here is. Not what concerns me at this moment. The sounds of the room were resolving, movement contained, voices low, the specific acoustic signature of a situation being brought under control by people who knew how to bring situations under control. Seo-jun registered it distantly, through the closer and more immediate reality of Lee Min-jae standing 18 inches in front of him, still not turning around, his presence doing the thing it had been doing since 8:03 p.m., reorganizing everything in its immediate vicinity without effort or apparent intention. You're shaking, Min-jae said. I'm aware. The door is closed. Nothing behind it is your problem anymore. Seo-jun looked at the back of Min-jae's head. The dark hair, the ink that curved above his collar, the absolute stillness of a man who seemed to generate calm the way other men generated heat, and felt something move through him that the suppressants, even at full capacity, would not have touched. Because it was not biological. Or not only biological. It was the specific and disorienting sensation of being stood in front of by someone who did not require anything from him in return. You didn't have to, he started. No, Min-jae agreed. I didn't. A silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable, because Han Seo-jun had no framework for silences with powerful alphas that were not uncomfortable. Across the room, Director Shin said something quiet into a phone. The bodyguard secured the service entrance. The suite settled into the particular stillness of aftermath, not peaceful, but resolved, the way a room felt after a storm had moved through and left the furniture rearranged. Min-jae turned around. He looked at Seo-jun the same way he had looked at him across the room 2 hours ago. Direct, unhurried, with that quality of attention that processed rather than performed. His eyes moved to the pulse point at Seo-jun's throat, briefly and without expression, and then back to his face. What is your name? He said. Not a question. The tone of a man collecting a fact he had decided he needed. Seo-jun met his gaze for exactly as long as he had allowed himself to meet it before. And then, because there was no professional blankness left in him and nowhere left to redirect it, kept meeting it. Han Seo-jun. Min-jae nodded once, as though filing it. Han Seo-jun, he said. You're going to tell me everything. The private room was on the 41st floor. Not a suite. Something smaller, more functional, with the spare and deliberate quality of a space that had been designed for conversations that required no witnesses and left no record. A table. For chairs. A window that looked out over the city at an angle that showed you exactly how far you were from everything ordinary. Min-jae had said nothing in the elevator. Director Shin had remained on the 42nd floor with the bodyguard and whatever remained of the evening's administrative consequences. The elevator doors had closed on the two of them with the finality of a chapter ending, and Seo-jun had spent the 11th-floor descent studying the middle distance and attempting, with limited success, to reconstruct some version of the chemical composure that the last 40 minutes had systematically dismantled. His scent was still present in the air. Quieter now, adrenaline receding, biology beginning the slow work of re-establishing its baseline, but present enough that he was aware of it the way you were aware of a bruise you kept accidentally pressing. Min-jae gave no indication that he was aware of it, which meant either that he wasn't, or that he had decided awareness was not a variable he intended to introduce into the room. Seo-jun had spent enough time around dangerous men to understand that those two things were not the same. Min-jae sat. He did not gesture for Seo-jun to sit, but there were only 2 chairs positioned at the table, and the implication was architectural. Seo-jun sat. The phrase you heard. Min-jae placed both hands on the table, open, which was either a deliberate signal of non-aggression or simply what his hands did when he was preparing to think. Walk me through it precisely. The clause, the phrasing, the construction. Seo-jun walked him through it. He used the correct archaic terms, reproduced the syntactic structure as accurately as his memory allowed, and explained, in the methodical, detached register of someone reporting rather than experiencing, how the kill order had been embedded in the exclusivity clause and what specific features of the construction had marked it as operational rather than stylistic. Min-jae listened without interrupting. His eyes did not move from Seo-jun's face. You recognized it immediately? Not immediately. 3 or 4 seconds. That's effectively immediate. A pause. Where did you learn the old language? Seo-jun had known this question was coming. He had known it the way you knew a door was at the end of a corridor. Not because you could see it yet, but because the corridor only went one direction. My father taught me. Your father. He believed it was important that I understand how certain kinds of communication worked. He said it was a survival skill. Min-jae's expression did not change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. A very slight intensification, the way a lens adjusted to bring something at its periphery into focus. What did your father do? The question landed in the specific way it always landed when Seo-jun was asked it. Not painfully, not anymore, but with the dull and familiar weight of something he had learned to carry without showing. He considered briefly the available deflections. He had several. He had constructed them carefully over years and deployed them smoothly enough that most people accepted them without pressing further. He looked at Lee Min-jae across a table in a room with no witnesses and understood, with the particular clarity that arrived when deflection became pointless, that none of them would work. He was a fixer, Seo-jun said. For 17 years. He worked for an organization based out of Gangnam, mid-tier, legitimate front in import logistics, the usual architecture. He was good at it. He was trusted. He stopped. Until he wasn't. The silence that followed was Min-jae's. Owned, deliberate, a space left open with the specific intention of being filled. His name, Min-jae said. Not aggressively. The tone of a man who had just felt something connect that he had not expected to connect, and was moving toward it carefully. Han Jae-won. The room did something then. It was not dramatic. Min-jae did not move, his expression did not fracture. Nothing so readable as that. But the quality of the silence changed, the way the quality of water changed when something beneath the surface shifted. And Seo-jun watched it happen with the detached and slightly vertiginous sensation of a man who had just said a thing he did not yet fully understand. Han Jae-won, Min-jae repeated. Yes. A long moment in which Min-jae looked at the table rather than at Seo-jun. The first time his gaze had moved away without purpose. And in that moment Seo-jun understood that the name had landed somewhere specific. Somewhere with furniture in it. Somewhere that had been there before tonight. My father trusted a man by that name, Min-jae said finally. He looked up. For 11 years. Before I took over the organization. He called him the most reliable person he had ever worked with in 30 years of operations. Another pause. He died in the winter. 14 years ago now. My father never recovered from it. Not from the loss of him, but from the circumstances. He believed it was a failure of his protection. He spent the rest of his life believing he had let a loyal man die because he hadn't seen the threat in time. Seo-jun's hands were very still on the table. It wasn't your father's failure, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. The threat was internal. Someone inside the organization had been building toward it for years. Clearing the path, removing the people who were too loyal to the existing structure to survive the transition of power. Min-jae's eyes had not moved from his face. Hyunwoo, he said. Not a question. I didn't know his name until tonight. Seo-jun looked at his own hands. I knew the shape of what had happened. I spent 2 years piecing it together from fragments. Conversations my father had referenced, contacts who went quiet, the specific timing of decisions that cleared certain people from certain positions. Someone was building a corridor to power. My father was standing in it. As was mine. Min-jae said it with the flat and unsentimental weight of a man who had lived long enough with a truth that speaking it no longer required preparation. My father died 4 years after yours. Cardiac event, officially. I was 23. I inherited the organization and Hyunwoo with it, positioned as the most indispensable person in the structure, because he had spent a decade making himself indispensable by removing every alternative. The city spread itself across the window behind him, 41 floors of lit and indifferent soul, and Seo-jun looked at it and understood. With the slow, structural comprehension of a building settling on its foundations, what tonight actually was. Not an interruption to his invisible life. Not an incident he had stumbled into and survived. A convergence. 2 families unmade by the same hands, their remnants deposited on opposite sides of a mahogany table in the Hanul suite, brought into the same room by a series of decisions that had begun long before either of them was old enough to understand the world they had been born into. He destroyed both of them, Seo-jun said. Both families. To clear the path. And then spent 14 years standing in the organization he'd cleared it for, waiting for the right transaction to finish what he started. Min-jae's voice was even. Completely, deliberately even. Tonight was not the first attempt. It was simply the first time someone in the room spoke the language. Seo-jun looked at him then, fully, without the professional management of duration or the careful calibration of what looking too long might communicate. He looked at Lee Min-jae, who had lost his father to the same architecture of betrayal that had taken his own, who had spent 14 years building an empire on a foundation that had been poisoned before he inherited it, and who was sitting across a small table in a room with no witnesses looking back at him with an expression that had, somewhere in the last 10 minutes, shed the quality of interrogation entirely. "You answered more than I asked," Min-jae said. "I know,"